Thanks, Jack.
Yep.
So just a couple quick announcements, and then it's going to be back over to Jack. So first of all, if you just joined, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your organization, and how familiar you are with the Farm Bill. 1 being not at all familiar, 5 being extremely familiar. Personally, I feel like I'm right around the middle in the 3 area. So I'm excited to learn from our guest speaker in just a few minutes. But just to update folks on some upcoming events that Food Council is hosting. Tomorrow, we actually have our local food procurement working group meeting. And I'm going to drop, or Jack, someone will drop a link to, thanks, Jack, to our events page in the chat for more details. I also want to highlight that we have an upcoming in-person tour of the University of Maryland dining service facility on July 18th in the morning. So that will highlight some of the local procurement that University of Maryland Dining Services is doing, and we're going to learn, how that's been going and how they're able to source from Maryland certified local farms. So exciting tour of University of Maryland. And then I also want to highlight, just because this is our advocacy call, a recent advocacy action that the Food Council took was to testify via written testimony in support of Montgomery County's Child Investment Fund bill. And I think Jack will likely drop a link to that written testimony into the chat at some point in the next few minutes. And it'll be updated on our policy tracker soon. With that, happy to pass it back to Jack to introduce our featured speaker. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle. I did just drop that link into the chat, and as Michelle said, it will be updated in the tracker before the end of the day. I am really, really excited to be able to introduce our featured speaker today. I'm lucky enough to know a lot about the Farm Bill because of our featured speaker today. We worked together when I was a graduate student at American University. So I'm really, really excited to be able to introduce Professor Garrett Grady Lovelace, who researches and teaches agricultural policy and agrarian politics at the American University School of International Service. A critical geographer, she draws upon political ecology and decolonial studies to research agricultural biodiversity, conservation, agrarian cooperatives, land use decisions, and global impacts on U.S. farm policies. She is a faculty affiliate for AU's Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center and associate director for the new Center for Environment, Community, and Equity. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Professor Grady Lovelace. And I think you should have ability to share your screen now also.
Yes, let's see. It should work. How is everybody?
Good. It's great to see you.
Great to see you. Let's see. I'm actually having a little trouble sharing screen. Let me go on mute and do a little bit of work, but feel free to cover a few other bases while I get my tech.
Yeah, of course. No worries at all. Just so people know, Professor Grady Lovelace was my professor when I was at American University. We worked together about a year ago on an anti-racist Farm Bill summit that we hosted down in Virginia. It took place, it's crazy to think about that. I graduated grad school a year ago. Took place a little more than a year ago around this time though. And it was focused at that time because the Farm Bill expired a year ago. So the Farm Bill has been expired for over a year now, and it was extended to maintain the same levels through 2024 that it was at from when it was proposed in 2018. So we are working on a 2018 Farm Bill that would have expired about a year ago. And yes, she is a co-host, so hopefully that will make it work. If worse comes to worse, you can always send me the presentation and I can share my screen as well.
Hello, everyone. Sorry for the tech issues.
No worries.
It's coming to Yeah. All right. So Jack, for some reason, it's not working on my end, but I've sent it to you. And so if you want to open it up and share it, we can dive in. Sorry about that.
No, no worries at all. Let me
Yes.
just get it loaded and feel free to get started while I wait
Great.
for that
All
email.
right. So I'm so delighted. Firstly, there's so many people on this call, and I feel like that's so inspiring that so many people are engaged in the Farm Bill process. I've been working on the Farm Bills for, I think now 3 of them. So 2008, and then 2012, we organized a big event in 2012 at American University. That ended up being the 2014 Farm Bill. And then we did a 2018 Farm Bill event, and then this big one with Jack last year. So I've kind of seen and I'll just kind of begin by saying it used to be that you would have the environmentalists, and then you had people interested in labor, then you had people interested in racial justice, and they were different camps. And now you have a very integrated and really critical and expansive set of coalitions that are thinking about racial justice through climate justice issues, through labor justice, through food justice, thinking about soil and pollinators, as well as broader kind of class inequities and food sovereignty issues. So it's a very integrating moment, frankly, to be in Farm Bill advocacy that feels very exciting to be part of. So the Farm Bill itself began about 100 years ago. And it was, let me just make sure this went through, part of the New Deal. So we kind of can kind of think about, let's see, make sure I've got the. All right, it seems to have exceeded the size limits. All right, so sorry, Jack, let me resend it to you via Gmail, and then I'll keep going. Eek. Not sure.
No worries at all. No worries. I think that the fact that it is the size limit to send something tells everyone how important the Farm Bill is and how much it really does cover in our food
A lot of
system.
slides I've prepped for you. So it should be coming soon. And yeah, so that is coming. Let me know if you get that, Jack. I was honored to be working with Jack, not just for our seminar, but also for our practicum. So he was a core part of the summit. And I dropped the link to the toolkit, the Pointing the Farm Bill Toward Racial Justice Toolkit, which was a culmination of a 7-month process of summarizing what our summit was in our congressional briefing last May. Last May, there was a lot of optimism around the Farm Bill. It looked like there was kind of an extraordinary bunch of marker bills that were going through. And it looked like we were going to have a Farm Bill on time in 2023. And it looked like it was going to have some really good climate justice. So even the justice for Black farmers looked like it was going to have some really strong, crop insurance expansions. And then things kind of, imploded in the House last summer. And then it did get extended. And so we're in a year-long extension of the 2023 Farm Bill. And now hopefully it'll be happening in 2024. There it is. Okay. So we'll just begin. Thanks, Jack. This looks great.
Of course.
I kind of usually begin by, it's the largest piece of legislation you've barely heard of, but you all have heard of this. So you all know that it is omnibus, meaning it is many things in one. And these numbers are a little dated and they're always a little fuzzy because there's 2 cycles. There's the negotiation cycle, the authorization cycle, and then the appropriation cycle. So even if things get authorized for a certain amount of funding, they might not be appropriated with that. So the kind of struggle of the Farm Bill persists even within the rhythm of a Farm Bill happens, and then 5 to 7 years later, another one happens. In between, there's still a lot of wrangling happening. It is iterative. So I don't know if any one of you all have read the Farm Bill or a Farm Bill. It's 1,000 pages and nearly incomprehensible. I actually study it for a living and I can't read it because it references itself. So you actually have to have read the previous ones to know what each one builds upon. And there's acronyms, there's numbers. It's a legal document. So it actually has a lot of legalese, and the acronyms change each Farm Bill. So the programs change, the acronyms change. So it actually is a lesson in a lack of civic engagement. It's actually preventing civic engagement, which is why the fact that it's gaining attention is so inspiring. And so we'll, next slide, think about how to engage it. So what's interesting about the Farm Bill is that the 2014 Farm Bill and the 2018 Farm Bill had exactly the same titles. Now think about this. 2014 was under the Obama administration. 2018 was under the Trump administration. These are very different administrations. So the fact that it was the same more or less means that there's something about the Farm Bill that is not, doesn't fall neatly into Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal. It actually upends our kind of dominant political binary. And we have to kind of think more critically about what the Farm Bill is and beyond the kind of two-party system. So we're going to circle back to this and unpack it a little later. Next slide. So I studied the origin of the Farm Bill, and it is actually a story about surplus and the crisis of surplus. So I've been in the National Agricultural Library archives in Beltsville, next slide, and been thinking about commodity surplus as a burden of empire. The US was expanding imperially in the turn of the century with the banana republics on into the kind of Monroe Doctrine, and the kind of imperial realm of the Western Hemisphere. Next slide. But commodity surplus was also the plumage of empire. The US, this kind of rising superpower, was very proud of its commodity surplus. Next slide. But it wasn't until World War I where the US got very involved. And this is how it happened. So in World War I, the US government decided that the US was going to feed the theater of war in the Middle East and in Europe. And so they ramped up production of wheat, and they incentivized all of these farmers to grow above and beyond what they were already growing. They were already growing for their regions, in kind of new train networks, but the government said double production. And so these farmers were ripping up, prairie grass, deep-rooted prairie grass, and planting more wheat, annual wheat crops, and prices were good. In 1914, prices were really good. In 1915, because Europe needed all the wheat. And what do farmers do when prices are high? They grow more. So farmers were growing more, plowing up more land, growing more. Then the survivors got out of the trenches of World War I and started growing their own wheat. And then there was too much wheat on the global market. What do farmers do when there's too much in the global market and prices fall? They grow more to make up for how much they invested in that new tractor and that new land. So then farmers were raising more and more to make up for the lost prices. And by 1919, prices collapsed to nothing. Next slide. And so all of these farmers gathered in DC to demand that the US get them out of the problem that the US got them in. The US government got them in this problem. Now, these pictures are largely white men, but there was the whole gamut from very rich to working class, communist to capitalist. And all of these farmers come together and said, we are going to strike and not grow anything unless you guarantee a fair price for what we're growing, because prices are zero. Next slide. And so a lot of mobilization was happening. At this point, what began as an agrarian crisis infected the banks, and then it became the whole Great Depression, which began as a farmer crisis. So by the late 1920s, you had this kind of bank infestation of bad debts and foreclosures, a lot of farmer bankruptcy. The Farmer Holiday Association was saying, we're going to take a holiday from farming because you all aren't going to pay us. So there was all of these kind of protests and a lot of political mobilization. Next slide. Meanwhile, the ecological disaster of all that overproduction came to the fore with the Dust Bowl. And so you had 1 million tons of topsoil in the air. And when you go to the USDA now and you ask them about the origin of the Farm Bill, they say when dust hit FDR's desk, the Farm Bill started. So the ecological and economic disaster of overproduction began the Farm Bill. Next slide. So all of a sudden, you had across the political parties, the communist, capitalist, everybody was agreeing that this cycle of overproduction was devastating environmentally, economically for everybody. Next slide. So what began as the Farm Bill was a way to have a supply management system where farmers were able to have this quota of you growing, you grow over here, we're all going to get a fair price. Granted, it was white male farmers who benefited, but it was a very elaborate supply management price support system oriented around the commodity title. And this was the kind of public good of agriculture. Next slide. But then already you had this tension by the 1940s, where even though there was an attempt to kind of end overproduction, there was still new fertilizers, new hybrid seeds. There was kind of the World War II had all of this kind of lot of chemicals coming out of it. So you still had overproduction happening, even though there was government attempts to limit overproduction. What did the government do? Deploy all this surplus into food stamps. And so the Farm Bill was very proud of this history of the fact that the surplus reduction was being deployed into food stamps. So that was not anything to be ashamed of, according to the government. That was the #1 goal of food stamps, was commodity crop surplus deployment. #2, feeding the hungry. Next slide. And then you had World War II. And so there, again, the government said, actually, remember when we said we were going to limit supply to help everybody out? Let's grow it big again so that we can win the war. Next slide. And thereafter, again, what happened after World War II? Prices were going to go down again because there was too much being produced. And so the government went into overdrive on deploying surplus internationally. And this was for geopolitical, to win the Cold War, as well as to win all these new countries that had thrown off colonialism. So this deployment of commodity crop surplus internationally was a geopolitical move of creating market development, dominance geopolitically, and dependence. The US rose to superpower status off of deploying surplus wheat. Next slide. And the archives are amazing. I mean, it is Egypt, it is Iran, it is Pakistan, it is Bangladesh, it is India, it is across the African continent. The US was just dumping this wheat with the big American flags, and that was preventing people from going communist, and it was called PO 480, which was the Food for Peace Act. And there's a whole geopolitics of it because it undermined food sovereignty in a lot of places. I mean, food aid was important if you're starving, but it also prevented people from purchasing from their own farmers. Next slide. And so by the time you get into the 60s and 70s, you've had this almost schizophrenia, in government, where still there was this attempt to have parity price supports, which is the way for the price support not to bottom out, and supply management so that you didn't have the overproduction of the Dust Bowl. But also the government said, like this guy, Earl Butz, actually, we're going to win the whole wide world and get bigger, get out, was the whole myth. And this idea of feeding the world with growing tons of wheat and tons of cotton and tons of sugar became part of the ethos of the US. It's a very racist myth, as if the world can't feed itself, So there was a whole kind of gendered and racialized kind of superiority with this feeding the world myth. But what happened in the 70s was that all these farmers got caught up in this myth and were growing, trying to kind of, grow their neighbors, buy off their neighbors' land, fence row to fence row. And the prices collapsed again, because at that point, the parity programs had gotten weaker. So by the next slide, 1980s, you had the farm crisis, and farmers went out of business in mass. There was farmer suicides in mass in the early 80s farm crisis. And many of you all probably know this. You all have parents who are part of this. So I've been studying the farm crisis, and all the remaining farmers went to DC, and they were like, you got us into this mess again. You're not paying us a fair price again. We're getting pennies again. We're dying from debt. And they called it, parity. And there was an amazing Black leadership to the farm justice movement, which is not talked about. So I've been working with the Federation, a group of Black farming cooperatives in the South, to kind of excavate the incredible Black leadership. Jesse Jackson was a leader in the farm justice movement in the 1980s. Next slide. And so anyway, I've got a lot in here about the farm justice movement in the 80s, because what was beautiful about it is that it was like farmers and workers together talking about corporate control of farming, and it was like people who were interested in anti-hunger and interested in farmer viability working together to end the corporate backlash. And I feel like right now farmers and anti-hunger are pitted against each other. So we need to reclaim this history. And an amazing, again, Black leadership there. So next slide. Anyway, I've worked a lot with how Black farmers themselves were able to use the parity program. So by the time, even though the parity program in the original Farm Bill was captured by racist white planters of the South to say you have to own the land to get this. And if you're a tenant farmer, you don't get it, which is a way to kind of make sure that only the white farmers were able to access these support systems. Nevertheless, the Black farmers who were able to get their own land were able to say, we have a base acreage of cotton, you pay us a fair price, and then we'll grow a massive garden and feed our community. So this kind of balance of a portion of a commodity crop and then food sovereignty and a local food system was a key part of 20th century agriculture, which I'm trying to kind of excavate it in our research. Next slide. And these other slides are about kind of how to update this parity model, because even when you talk to these Black farmers, this was about 10 years ago, they say, if you don't have a solid price floor for farmers, white, Black, small, medium size, they're not going to make it. No farmer can make it when you're getting paid pennies. And then it's just a recipe for consolidation. Next slide. And so anyway, I've got a lot on here. Without the farm program, it doesn't make sense to farm. So next slide. We'll kind of keep rolling through these to get to. So again, even though there was this mobilization around updating parity prices and supply management to make sure that small and mid-sized farmers could have a go at it and make a living, nevertheless, those got eroded. And by the 1996 Farm Bill, they were gone. So everybody should know this. The 1996 Farm Bill ended supply management and parity pricing so that at this point now, the corporations decide the prices, not farmers. And guess what the corporations want to pay? Pennies. So the number of farms that were able to make a living went down, and then the average size went up. So at this point, very few people farm for a living. You have 10,000 acre farms in the middle of Iowa, and they're owned by a corporation. And then the kind of overall share of our community of people who farm for a living has declined precipitously. And I'll just say the 1986 Farm Bill, the reason why that was the kind of death knell of all of this was because of the WTO, which said you have to have a total free market, get all government out of this, have the free market decide all the prices. Next slide. Okay, so what happens that by the 1990s, the US was producing so much, there was no supply management anymore. And so they had this problem again of overproduction, and they dumped it internationally. The number of trade exports zoomed through the roof. So at this point, we are enormous quantities of traded food internationally. This is called globalization. So I eat an apple from New Zealand. The New Zealanders eat the same apple that was grown in the US. We're just kind of flowing food around the whole wide world. And it's terrible for the environment and terrible for farmers, mostly, except for the big growers like Driscoll. So the US agricultural policy's path dependency of enabling monocultural overproduction exported all of this away into dumping. And dumping is where you're exporting below the cost of production, and this destroys farmer viability around the world. And so I'm working internationally with all these groups that are saying, stop this, we can't compete with your cheap subsidized goods. Next slide. But this is the secret right here. We think of like the farmers as being the rich people, right? In fact, very few people farm left, and the ones who do farm are rich because they have a combine the size of my house. You know what I mean? They're like the huge landowners. There's no one left, so of course they're rich by default. But actually, the median income from farming is below zero. They get that money because of the assets of the land and the subsidies from the government and the kind of payments from the government. Which are subsidies is such a fuzzy word, which we'll talk about. So it's actually just offset programs from the government, not the farm gate prices that are leading to them. So this is a really fascinating secret that farming is not a livelihood, even for people who farm. They get their money elsewhere. It's off farm income. Next slide. This is some other data on this. And this slide over here, the median farm income below zero, and it's all off farm income or the assets of the land that's actually providing that wealth for those people. So next slide, which has enormous implications for racial justice. So what does that mean? That the people who are buying are having a bonanza because they're getting things for so cheap. The people who are selling inputs are having a bonanza because farmers are in this treadmill of having more and more and more, bigger and bigger and bigger, or get out. So that means that the corporations have had a field day and are getting massively powerful as farmers are getting fewer and fewer, and the diversity is really terrible. And the farm debt is growing. And this is some incredible numbers of how the farm debt right now is as high as it was in the 80s. So we're in a farm crisis right now, which explains some of the farm bill stuff that's happening now. Next slide. Okay, so you all know this, but the consolidation, we just have to keep talking about it. It is unprecedented. There's like 4 companies that control our food system. You know, I mean, like Smithfield dominates the pigs, JBS dominates the beef, Monsanto Bayer dominates the seed, Dow DuPont dominates part of the seeds as well. Like, it's like worse than the imperial colonialism of old. These companies are more powerful than the empires of old. And we have to start talking about how this consolidation, vertical, horizontal consolidation is out of control in terms of like our food sovereignty, you know, and our control of our food system. And farmers aren't the winners, it's the companies. Next slide. Obviously, CAFOs are the winners because guess what CAFOs depend upon? Mountains of cheap grain. So if you actually had the price of grain, if corporations had to pay the real price, then the price would lift up, and then you wouldn't have this kind of enabling of these kind of enormously dangerous industrial factory farming, which are the result of mountains of surplus cheap grain, falsely cheap grain. Next slide. And obviously, you all know the ecological dimensions of this kind of monocrop overproduction, enormous dead zone eutrophication, nitrification in the Gulf of Mexico, incredible water. All these fishermen in the deep south and the delta are suffering algal bloom, really horrible kind of nitrous oxide emissions, as well as carbon emissions, and of course, methane emissions from the CAFOs. Next slide. But there's new data coming out about how CAFOs are actually core to the climate crisis. People are like, oh, you know, fossil fuels are the enemy, and they are. Industrial factory farming and ag is the enemy, industrial. And so the kind of divestment needs to shift to also talk about the ag dimensions of the climate crisis. Next slide. Okay, so now we see this again. It's the crisis of surplus. Commodities was a way to prevent the economic disaster of overproduction, conservation a way to get rid of the ecological disaster of overproduction, trade and nutrition are the deployment of surplus, And once rural livelihoods stopped becoming a livelihood and rural development was a way for rural poverty, to be mitigated. And even energy is just surplus disposal. That's renewable fuel standard, is having biofuel and all that mountain of corn be used into gasoline, a way to just get rid of the surplus. So all the good stuff of the Farm Bill is tucked into miscellaneous in horticulture, but that's pennies. And the whole kind of system of overproduction enabling and erasure is the rest of the kind of bread and butter of the Farm Bill. Next slide. And so this is all review, but just to know that the commodity title used to be good. It wasn't perfect because the racists kind of got a hold of it, but the central premise of it was small and mid-sized farmers deserve to be on the land, and they are the price makers and the corporations are the price takers. And this kind of cooperative economics of supply management has a fascinating history. But now it is a disaster, which we'll talk about. And at this point, it is just price loss coverage and agricultural risk coverage, which are ways for the government to pay the farmer, not the corporations, who actually are the ones who need to be paying what they're getting. And the Republican version has increased both price loss coverage and agricultural risk coverage up to 20% each, which just means more money going to the huge landowners, which are disproportionately white and corporate men or corporations. Next slide. The conservation title is fascinating, and there's so much to it, but I'll just say this. It used to be that the conservation title was you idle lands or you grow food on them, right? Like either it's not in production, it's environmental, or it grows food. That's not nature. That's not how the ancient ways have worked. So finally, there was the working lands, which is the purple, which is where you grow food and you protect pollinators at the same time. It's an ancient indigenous concept, but somehow it took us a long time to get into the Farm Bill. So that's why EQIP, which is a gorgeous program, and CRP, which is a gorgeous program, all of these, CSP is the most amazing program, and there's new acronyms. Actually, it's a little dated, but I liked the kind of time frame. These are they need to be expanded, and the Inflation Reduction Act, next slide, did expand them. So you all know that $20 billion got inputted in the Inflation Reduction Act a few years ago, and the Republican version is wanting to get rid of the climate guardrails and take the remaining $15 billion and turn it into things like precision ag, which is just going to help the big combine guys. So we can talk about IRA if you want, but really there's like a showdown happening on the climate guardrails of the existing $15 billion of what's left of the Inflation Reduction Act, and making sure that goes to EQIP and that goes to the CRP and the CSP where it needs to go. Next slide. And diversify who gets it. So it's a lot of Black and Indigenous and Latinx and immigrant farmers as well. Trade title. Okay, so trade title has historically been, moving surplus. We all just learned this through these market access programs and kind of strong arming people around the world from importing our goods. I mean, I'm just going to say it. I work in a school of international service, and that's what it really is. It's like, we will make a deal with you if you buy our things and not your own farmers' things. So I find it very coercive, and there's a lot of resistance to it. On the other hand, trade is good. It just has to be trade that works for farmers and doesn't undermine their viability. And the current trade title, the House version, Republican version, doubles expenditure on trade promotion programs in a very coercive way. And there's other parts about the trade title which get very insidious, but we can talk about them later. Next slide. And I'll just say this, the House version increases commodity payments by $53 billion in that price loss coverage and agricultural risk coverage, again, just going to the richest landowners, and then justifies it by offsetting the expenditure by cutting $27 billion from the Thrifty Food Plan for SNAP, which we'll talk about with Jack and others. So just so you can kind of see the broader context of this. It's not saving money. They're just paying a lot of money to the rich farmers and then, cutting SNAP, and there's other things there which we can talk about. You all know this. Okay, we'll kind of move through this because I think nutrition title is coming later. Even though the Farm Bill has a billion things in it, there's so much that's not in it, which we can talk about here. Labor's not in it. There's no antitrust. There's no agrobiodiversity. Fisheries aren't even included. There's lots of stuff that's not in the Farm Bill that needs to be. Next slide. There was some few wins in the 2018 Farm Bill. You all should know, and everyone should know, LAMP acronym, which is a new acronym, which is great. It should be kind of a super expanded local ag marketing program. FOTO, which is the anti-racist work. It used to be called 2501. Now it's called Farmer Outreach Training Operations. We want way more funding for FOTO, which is making sure Black farmers, Indigenous farmers, Latinx farmers get more resources. Heirs property did have some wins, but that needs to be expanded. And then hemp got decriminalized, but it has not worked out for small farmers or mid-sized farmers or farmers of color, and a few other things. Next slide. Okay, sorry, I included this twice. Next slide. Okay, there, I will just, though, the Justice for Black Farmers Act, which had a lot in the marker bills, which is very important, was not included in the Republican, and we just need to be thinking about the debt cancellation. We can talk about this in another time, or I think you all already know this, but just that there was a lot of momentum around helping Black farmers, and it's being curtailed right now through very racist kind of backlash. Next slide. Okay, so we had a huge event 2018. I'm going to drop the link, next slide, to our special feature, which had 15 articles about the Farm Bill, long history by great diverse. And so if you're interested in that, I can drop the link. And then next slide. We started the Disparity to Parity project, and I'll drop the link to that. But this is a way to update that price parity and supply management for farmers of color so that they can actually stay on the land. And so I'll drop that link for you. Next slide. Next slide. And then we started working with the Federation, which is a whole network of civil rights, Black farming from the 60s. They've kept going for now 60 years, incredible network. And we put on, next slide, with all these other great orgs, this incredible summit. And Jack was key to that. It was a 3-day summit, and then it culminated with the Senate briefing, and then this toolkit, which I dropped in the chat box. Next slide. And there's a lot of good information there. And I will say the marker bills from this year were so inspiring. And even though a lot of them are not going to make it into the Farm Bill, it looks like, I feel like the momentum is bigger than the current, terrible House leadership. Next slide. And so here's where we are. We're in a showdown. And I think SNAP is what's getting all of the kind of red flags because it needs to, but there's so many other problems with the House version and even the Senate Republican version, which just came out a week ago. Next slide, which we can talk about. And I'm just going to end with seeds, which is my real love. There's some great seed work happening for agrobiodiversity, Black and Indigenous led agrobiodiversity. And so we're working with the USDA on their new seed liaison and working with Ujamaa Cooperative Farming Alliance. And we have some meetings all last year and this year thinking about how to counter kind of the vast corporate consolidation of the seed sector, have there be more seed sovereignty in kind of urban areas and historically marginalized areas, and working toward cooperatives and sovereignty. And then next slide. As well as solidarity. We're working with a Palestine heirloom seed library. Palestine is being starved right now, and the U.S. is implicated. And so we're really thinking about countering starvation as a weapon, as well as cultivating seed and food and land solidarity with our Palestinian colleagues. And that's it. Next slide. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor. I really, really appreciate it. I have access to most of those links. I see you're dropping them in the chat. So I will make sure they go out in the follow-up as well. So that everyone has, if you don't get access to them now, they will definitely be included in our follow-up email on Friday. I want to open the floor up for questions that anyone may have for anything regarded. As Garrett said, I will be covering a few of the SNAP related ideas in my next presentation after this, so we can if there's anything specifically about that, we might be able to wait and get answers, no guarantees. But I know I have a few questions, but before that, I want to open up the floor to anyone who may have a question for our speaker.
Jack, so I don't have a question, but I just want to use this opportunity to say a huge thank you to Dr. Lovelace. Hi, everyone. I don't know if a lot of you here have met me, but I'm the executive director for the Montgomery County Food Council. And so thank you so much, for just giving us this historical, background to this very important bill. I, for one, did not know a lot of these things. And so I think it just kind of elevates the level of importance of this particular bill and what it is now, especially coming for the Food Council in Montgomery County, where, we see that our SNAP budget got cut, and that was $60,000 that would have been used to for the SNAP program, which would have allowed us to have $3 million injected into the local economy. So these are just examples of things that I wish everyone knew. And I just want to really thank you for just laying it all out and just teaching us, really. And I really appreciate it. Thank you for being here with us today. And so I'll open it up now and let others take over and ask any questions they may have. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.
Any questions? Like I said, I do have a question ready.
I'm seeing some in the chat, Jack. So Rona I don't know, Rona, if you'd like to come off mute or if you want me to read your question. Giving you an opportunity. But Rona has a question about the Hot Foods Act. I'm not sure if you have any knowledge or anything to share.
Yeah, so great questions. So I will say, I used to kind of give like guesses as to what's happening. There's so many wild cards right now that I don't know if I can go on record. The Hot Foods Act, and I think we'll get to this when we get to SNAP later. The Republican version is has long tried to police and surveil what people who need food assistance eat and buy for their families. And keep in mind, as you all know better than me, these people work 4 jobs, 3 jobs, are trying to make ends meet, are in gentrifying cities. So there's a broader kind of injustice and food apartheid at work here. And then just trying to access food for their families, and the surveillance and policing of preventing people from buying hot foods and just buying foods. And it's so patronizing, kind of like, you just need to cook from scratch, as if people have working kitchens, as if people, like, if they're in like a slumlord situation, maybe they don't even have access to like a good working kitchen. So the kind of patronizing and racist and sexist and classist surveilling and policing of people who are needing food assistance is being countered with the Hot Foods Act, which is a way to just expand, access to food, to provide hot meals for your family and have SNAP cover that. That's crazy that it needs to be a fight, but that is part of the broader struggle here. So I feel like, I will say this, the pushback to the cut on SNAPs is so powerful. That I feel that even though there's entrenched forces, trying to kind of slash SNAP, the kind of coalitional work and the grassroots work is so strong in the advocacy work, that there could be a way to get the Hot Foods Act and other ways to prevent this policing. And I'll say the question here about the EATS Act, I forgot to mention the kind of specific details because I wanted the history, because people kind of overlook the incredible history. But the EATS Act is a confluence, and Food and Water Watch has a good overview of kind of corporate control of food systems. So the little ways to mitigate corporate control, animal welfare over here, way to kind of stop, certain kind of labor practices or environmental practices or pesticide practices, and have some kind of labor or environmental protections. The EATS Act really undermines it in a very insidious way by having states kind of enforcing a federal over state, even though states' rights, there's such a hypocrisy to it. But I will say that the mobilization to counter the EATS Act has been so effective that the House Republican version did not include the EATS Act as such. They included parts of it. It was very sneaky. But the fact that they had to step back means that the mobilization was strong enough to say you cannot just cut and paste the EATS Act in. But I don't know if others have other things to weigh in or what you all think.
I know we have JD Douglas Robinson from Maryland Hunger Solutions on the call as well, who might know a little more about the SNAP related bills as well. So I just wanted to see if JD had anything he wanted to add, and then over to you, Michael, after that.
Yeah. Hey, can you hear me? Sorry, I'm having some mic troubles today.
Yeah, sounds
Cool.
good.
Yeah, I mean, this is, the fact that we didn't really get the whole farm bill done last year, and a lot of the uncertainties that are happening this year. I know, Jack, you're going to be kind of touching on the Hill visits that we did earlier in the year as well. But, it's kind of, we're in a position where we're seemingly playing a lot of defense on the House version. The Senate version is definitely the one that we want to make sure gets pushed forward. But again, it's kind of trying to look at tea leaves, look at the crystal ball kind of thing. And trying to figure out what exactly can be happening. The strange thing I will say is that the House version, despite all of its flaws, actually does contain some good stuff, which is definitely a little surprising to kind of have that balance of both good SNAP provisions and bad ones. However, we just had one that was introduced as far as a potential marker bill a couple of weeks ago, if not days, which is the Enhanced Cybersecurity Act for SNAP of 2024. This is Senator Fetterman, Cassidy, and Wyden, and Representatives Kim and Lawler. And this is more or less just trying to really kind of dial in and focus a lot of efforts around making sure we get chip cards for EBT users, that we make permanent the federal reimbursement program. And so, that, may survive. But, there's also the, between whether or not this is all done through the Farm Bill or if the vehicle is appropriations and continuing resolutions, there's a lot that can happen, but also may not happen. I'm so sorry that this answer is very just middle of the road and unclear, but that's just kind of where we're at right now. The Hot Foods Act is definitely something that is been encouraging and definitely one that we've talked a lot with our representatives about, and actually seems to may even be catching some ground as potentially being somewhat up on both sides of the aisle. But it's something that can hopefully survive a lot of these markups that have been happening for both the House and the Senate version. And we'll see how these discussions keep going and what kind of shakes out at the end.
Thank you, JD. I see a couple questions in the chat, but I'm going to go to the 2 raised hands first and then those. So Michael, over to you next. Still muted.
Sorry, Jack. Thank you. I assume you mean me.
No
Okay,
worries.
yeah. There's
Yep.
another Michael in the group. I just want to make
no,
sure.
you're good.
Yeah. Professor Lovelace, thank you so much for your presentation. I always love seeing someone from AU as an alumni. So my question, and I apologize if it's broad, but this is influenced by the part of your presentation about food sovereignty. And how would you define food sovereignty at the state and local level? And how does that connect back internationally? And just another background on the question, it's influenced by, there was a very prominent Washington Post article back in 2021 about how a lot of the COVID era food relief programs, a lot of them activists and policymakers were trying to move towards from a food security framework to the food sovereignty framework. And there was a lot of confusion, at least for me as a layman, over that term. So, because when I think of that in international level. So I was wondering if you could connect that food sovereignty term at the local and state level. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I will say the word food sovereignty about a decade and a half ago, I was using it because internationally it got used, and the history of its usage internationally is so powerful. It really began in the 90s as a pushback to the World Trade Organization. So the World Trade Organization, for a long time, the GATT did not include food. You trade steel, you trade other, goods, industrial goods. The idea of trading food as if it was a commodity like any other commodity is very recent in human history. That there would just be it could be up in the air as to what prices it receives and the farmers and in terms of consumers. So it was really the mid-90s that implemented this idea, a very kind of neoliberal idea, that food is a commodity like other commodities. And the global pushback was massive. So the Via Campesina began saying, we want food sovereignty, and they articulated that as a rebuttal to the WTO. So that's kind of an interesting history. And then we kind of, move a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades later into, the current food system. And it's elusive and it's complicated and it means different things for different people. So there's no hard and fast definition in the US context. And I will say the Nileni Food Declaration, which I'll also drop the link, is considered a global kind of reference point. It began by saying we want kind of food sovereignty against the WTO, but then it pushed back by saying it's not at the national level, because it was a lot of indigenous leadership saying our heads of state, Brazilian head of state, Indian head of state, actually is oppressing us, the Mexican head of state. And so we as indigenous people want our food sovereignty at our indigenous level, community level, not at the state level, because that would further kind of impinge upon our food systems. So this tension around how to implement and institutionalize and legalize food sovereignty is really, it's a robust debate. Maine did put it in their legislative system. So I feel like we should all kind of know what's happening in Maine. It's not perfect, and there's a way in which it's like an evolving concept, but I feel like the core element of it is that from a farmer standpoint and fisher standpoint and a food provider standpoint and a farm worker standpoint, it is to center people who provide food and their agency in the food system. So they are not passive victims or passive, kind of recipients of the kind of a dominant food system or a dominant food model. So both urban and in rural, there's a way in which people who are at the front lines of the labor of food and of cooking food and serving food and growing food and providing food for their families at the front line of anti-hunger need to be the deciders and have agency in the food system. So there's kind of almost like a philosophical or an ethical dimension, but how this actually pans out in terms of federal legislation at the Farm Bill level, I feel like this is a burning question for us. So frankly, it sounds like you've been thinking about this. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it as well.
Well, I think about it in terms of land use policy and the debate that's been about, Jack, I remember you had a testimony at the planning board about using our parks system in Montgomery County where people can grow food. Of course, the not pushback, but maybe some people who are skeptical about it is it's just more efficient for people to go to a supermarket and buy their food. Of
Mhm.
course, then they're participating in the system that you so clearly described. And just as a little bit of a background, I grew up in a household where my mother grew up on a very small farm in Puerto Rico, which no longer exists for various reasons. It should still exist because that provided food for her when but that's neither here nor there. So that's how I started to be more aware of these issues on food sovereignty because I thought about it, Jack, during your planning board uh, presentation back in October or September. I forget now when it was.
Michael, I will say that Puerto Ricans actually are teaching us and me and the people I'm working with about food sovereignty. So the fact that you brought that up, that's actually, it's both here and there. That's actually central within the kind of context that we're in, particularly after Hurricane Maria. And all of these people on the island were not assisted by the federal government, and yet have this arable land in this year-long growing season. And a lot of the land tenure system around the best land is used by kind of corporations that aren't even based on the island. So the food and land sovereignty kind of model and ethos and work, actually Puerto Rico, I would say, is a leader in that, and the Puerto Rican, particularly the youth and the young people of Puerto Rico.
Well, I wish my mother was here. I happened to be in New York with her for a few weeks. She would love to hear about this. I should ask her.
I'll send links. I love that, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I was just going to turn it over to David real quick for probably one of our last questions here, and then to you, Michelle.
Thanks. So first of all, thank you, Professor, for your presentation. I have to first say I'm kind of disappointed that I didn't know about this, the work that you and Jack had done a year ago when I was finishing my graduate degree in food policy related things, and I was at GW, not at American, and so I feel kind of like that I didn't get to work with y'all on this then, because this would have been very much exactly what I was working on in my own classwork. And so in that vein, I was hoping that you could expand a little on what's going on in this current farm bill as relates to the federal crop insurance program. I know it's the second largest program, or the second largest chunk of funding after SNAP, and it is very much sort of a handout to wealthy farmers. But I was hoping you could kind of expand upon what's happening right now and what the competing visions for that program look like. Thank you.
Yes, it's so key. So with climate crisis and with the variabilities of, pricing and the volatility of pricing and kind of a very neoliberalized, very globalized food system, there's no security for farmers in terms of they're going to get what they're going to get at the end of their harvest. So crop insurance is both crucial, and yet the way it's currently delivered enables monocultural production, which is already very ecologically not resilient, and prevents diversification, because you can only get crop insurance if you have a large base and your crop is on the crop list. And there's a whole racial dimension to this too. So there's all of these immigrant farmers who are growing beautiful food for their communities, and their crops aren't on the list because they're considered ethnic crops. And so there's a way in which even the list incentivizes commodity crop production and monocultural production. So there's been excellent work by Rural Coalition, by World Farmers, by HEAL, a lot of really good organizational work to expand the whole farm revenue program, which is where the whole farm actually is insured, not just crop by crop, and allowing the crop list to be expanded, and allowing the bureaucracy, which is a terrible mess of bureaucracy, to be streamlined for small and low resource farmers. So some of the best marker bills, and I included Rafi's marker bill tracker, are about crop insurance reforms. So I actually feel like that is some of the best work happening in terms of marker bills, is really good reforms on those. But the House version did not include those, and in fact added more red tape to the whole farm revenue program. And there's a few other kind of showdowns happening in crop insurance. So I will just kind of leave it. I'll drop the links to the people I would follow. Obviously, National Sustainable Ag Coalition has some great stuff on the nitty gritty of some of these conservation programs and crop insurance, as well as National Family Farm Coalition. So I'll kind of have my grassroots civil organizing collaborators speak to the details of it, but I'll just say it is the current showdown, because climate and volatility are only going to get worse. But thank you for the question.
Over to you, Michelle.
Thanks. So I know that we have 8 minutes left, and I know Jack is going to talk a little bit about Lobby Day, that is very relevant to this conversation. But I also want to, and maybe, so I'll turn it over to Jack right after I ask this question, but I'm wondering if before we all head out at 2, if we could hear, just your thoughts on what's going to happen. There's an election. I know there's tea leaves. I know but there's also a really major election. Is there a possibility that this gets kicked to then or will it get expanded for another year? What are the opportunities? What are the risks? And how do we insert ourselves or as advocates for these really important issues in trying to make the change that we want happen occur?
It's a great question. It sounds like many of you all are already deeper into the Hill and know the staffers, and I'll say the staffers know what's going on. They oftentimes know more than their bosses' representatives. Stabenow is retiring, and she's kind of an old guard, and I feel like she doesn't want to end on a weak note. Like, her whole kind of legacy is around the Farm Bill. So I feel like we do have an ally, and that she is not going to let SNAP get slashed, and her team, it's not just her, or the climate guardrails be thrown off, or even the racial justice mobilizations be kind of, thrown under the bus. So I feel like we need to go strong on supporting the kind of Senate version and making it better. It is not perfect. There's so many compromises, but also know that the kind of politics of this are that she is an ally. And then in terms of the election, I just don't know. I feel like I'm baffled, but I'll pass the mic to people who feel like they would know more.
And I'm happy to take it from there, because in terms of Chairwoman Stabenow and kind of how we can play a role in this in our own advocacy, I can share a little bit about what we did. Organized by which, so if JD, if you have anything you'd like to add, please feel free to jump in whenever. Organized by the Food Research and Action Center. Earlier this month, from June 3rd to 5th, was the National Anti-Hunger Policy Conference, which brought together anti-hunger advocates from across the country. So Maryland, obviously, but really it was looking at the country as a whole. There were listening sessions, panel discussions, and a lot of the notes and information are recorded. And there are notes on a lot of the panel discussions as well. So I will make sure that information gets into our follow-up email as well, so you can learn more about some of those conversations that took place. But I just wanted to specifically highlight the last day of the conference was a lobby day with Maryland advocates and with advocates across the country. So all of the members in the conference went and met with their their representative from whatever state they came from. So for us, for Naya and myself, we joined other Maryland advocates, including Maryland Hunger Solutions, Elizabeth Epps, who's one of our board members, JD, who spoke earlier, as well as Jackie, who I see is in the call as well, from Manna Food Center, and LaMonica, the interim director of Maryland Hunger Solutions, to meet with our Maryland representatives. And the Maryland Hunger Solutions team was there all day meeting with Maryland representatives. I joined for the part of the afternoon when we were meeting with the Montgomery County specific representatives, but we joined these meetings to really advocate. And for us, that meant advocating for SNAP and protecting SNAP. And we are lucky here in Montgomery County that a lot of our representatives are with us, and they are championing these ideas right alongside us. So we found lots of support from our federal representatives, from our senators, from our congressmen as well. And it was just a really great opportunity. We were able to meet with senators, with the staff of Senator Chris Van Hollen, as well as Senator Ben Cardin even was able to come in and join for a quick picture in our meeting as well. But just wanted to emphasize that happened. So there are people all across this country doing work to advocate for a farm bill, and a farm bill that ensures those protections for SNAP. FRAC and Maryland Hunger Solutions put some great resources together about specific things to advocate for in the Farm Bill, and I will drop those in the chat as soon as I stop sharing my screen here and include them in the follow-up as well. But I wanted to just show this to show that there are people all across the country that are having conversations with elected officials, having conversations at a local level, having conversations with farmers to make sure that these issues are brought up, and that proposals that focus only on big wealthy corporations are not the proposals that are being pushed through, and that there is pushback on these proposals as well. So I just want to say it was a great experience for myself to be able to sit in on these meetings and learn from other Maryland advocates about how this really happens and how these conversations take place when it comes to advocating for such key aspects of such major bills. And again, so happy to see that our representatives, especially here in Montgomery County, are so supportive of the things that we are advocating for as well. And that was just really quick. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I also just wanted to ask if either Jackie, Naya, or JD wanted to add anything, because I know you all were there as well.
No additions, Jack. I think you captured it all perfectly. Thank you.
Yep. This Jack thinks that Jack did great.
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah, nothing to add, Jack. That was great.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for organizing, to the Maryland Hunger Solutions team, especially. We are right at time here, so I'm going to stop our recording now just so I don't forget. If there